let's get started straight away because we've got a lot to pack into the next panel. I've been told that we have an extra 10 minutes from the scheduled, or 5 minutes, so we'll be finishing at 1:40, so if you can hold on for lunch another 5 minutes, that gives us a little bit more time for our conversation. This session is called Women Driving the Digital Revolution, and we have two women who have been driving this digital revolution for
very successfully in the numbers, frankly, but anyway,
we can come to that. My name's Emily Taylor. I'm an Associate Fellow here at Chatham House and editor of the Journal of Cyber Policy. And we'll be having a quick conversation with Anne Cairns, who is the Executive, the Executive Vice Chairman of MasterCard, and Martha Lane Fox, who is the Founder and Executive Chair of Everyone. So can we just get started? Anne, can I start with you? MasterCard is very active on promoting financial inclusion. Can you just make the link very briefly here for us today between why financial inclusion is a necessary part in empowering women to drive the digital revolution?
Right. So if you're excluded from the financial world, it's very difficult to do anything in the business world. And also, it's very difficult to actually manage your life in terms of what you want to achieve for your family. We believe that you can't be successful in a failing world. And we believe that it's really important to connect people up to the internet, but also to make that connection useful. So it's no good getting people, digital IDs and getting them the ability to actually charge up computers if they have no ability to actually run their lives through that. So we actually committed to bring the next 500 million people into the financial system. Many of those are women because women are more financially excluded than men. And so far, we've run about 750 projects around the world to bring in 400 million. So we're actually on track to achieve this.
And what are you most proud of? If you think of, if there's one example or case study that really most signifies to you the success of that project, what would it be?
Well, there's many I could point to, but the latest one that I absolutely love is in many parts of Africa and many parts of the world, women can't get collateral to run their business. They can't get bank loans. And so what we did was we got together with Unilever, and they are supplying goods to small shopkeepers. These shopkeepers run out of goods on their shelves because they need the cash to actually buy the next lot of soap powder or whatever they're buying. So we digitized the whole supply chain through from Unilever to the person coming into the small shop, they're called dukas in Africa, buying the goods. And we presented that data to a local bank, KBC Bank in Kenya, who then lent the women money on the basis of this without collateral. And we did 15,000 shops as a pilot, and what we found was sales increased by 20% in the first few months of rolling this out. And we think that this solution could be something that could really start addressing supply chains and getting women included in, the full financial system. I think it's such a great example.
Thank you very much. And Martha Lane Fox, you started lastminute.com 20 years ago. You are a female digital driving the digital revolution. When did you first realize that there was a problem with women in tech?
I think probably in the first VC meeting that we had, where Brent, my co-founder, and I were sitting, we had one question from the VC behind his huge mahogany desk, and he looked at Brent and he said, "What happens if she gets pregnant?" I was 24. Wow. So I think then you see it from a kind of what anger. It's like, let me start my business point of view. But now, at the grand old age of 46, from the other things I do, I see the structural challenge. And that's the reason I was being slightly glib and interrupting you, because I think you saw the McKinsey numbers earlier, but I feel completely astonished that this technology that is only really 30 years old, 30, 40 years old, has so entrenched, to my mind, existing hierarchies, right?
How did this happen? happen, right? I mean, this
It's
should
really
be
staggering.
liberating everything.
It's really staggering. And when you hear
The
and talk, it's so
opportunities
exciting. Exactly.
for working remotely,
Yep.
for flexible
Yep.
working. I mean, technology should
Yeah.
offer all of this. We heard from Anne's story.
And when you look at the people who are building the future, it is still white men, and that is very, very profoundly bad. So no, but largely, if you think about where the power and the money is, yes, I would absolutely right, but I would categorize it still as it's a culture led by Silicon Valley, increasingly by China, but that's a pretty recent phenomenon in the last 3-4 years. Still very heavily male dominated, and so therefore the power, the jobs, the skills, the people who are deciding what the design of the products and services should be that we use and what they are still being led by such a small spectrum of the potential that it could be. And then I would argue that means that we don't solve necessarily the problems that are the most pressing problems. Exactly to Anne's point, you know, that's a joined up way of thinking that those are the pressing problems that people see at a local level. But when you look at the money going into some bits of the sector, it doesn't, to my mind, flow through in such a fair way.
I think Martha's point, you know, about Silicon Valley and China driving this revolution is particularly relevant in the AI part of the industry. And I actually was talking to a very eminent Chinese AI guru, 50 million followers on YouTube. I guess you can guess who he is. But I said to him last week, I said, you know, one of the things I'm concerned about here is that we could be perpetuating an East-West divide by basically programming the computers to think one way in one geography and another way in another geography. And he said, yeah, almost certainly. Which was like, well, very reassuring.
Yeah,
but to
value systems,
absolutely
I think, you know, it's
different
very different.
values. And also to Martha's point, if it's too many men programming the computers, what are they actually teaching them to think? You know, are we perpetuating this model, which is how the world works now? Because we don't want the world to work that way in the future.
And if we were doing the world now, thinking about the next generation of women leaders in the digital space, what questions should we be asking, and what priorities should we be having in mind? How do we get there? Martha, can
Well, I think a couple of things. Firstly, my life has been transformed by being an entrepreneur and understanding a bit about the digital world. I can't code. I've never coded a line of software in my life. I used to keep a Java programming book on my desk to scare the tech team in case they thought I could understand what they were doing. But I have not got a fear of it, and I would just encourage all women and girls not to be frightened of it, whatever role you're in. You might be running a school, running a hospital, in public policy. It is not okay to pretend that the modern world doesn't exist and that you can sort of absent yourself from technology. So I think having a deeper digital understanding is really important. And secondly, that being coupled with entrepreneurialism in the way that Anne describes and the things MasterCard are doing are so powerful when you look at some of the people that face the biggest challenges over the next decade and the climate challenges that we're staring into, often in places in the world that people don't have the resources to get the technology that we're talking about. If you can match up entrepreneurialism, the latest technology tools, empowering women, I really do believe we can crack more problems.
And just a very last one, because we're already out of time, just watching Stefan, because we can't be late. But often we don't talk about the environment enough when we're talking about technology, and we assume that because our phones look lovely and clean, that this isn't an environment-consuming technology. And on answering the right questions and thinking about the communities in which you are active, who are very challenged by climate change, how can we be doing technology in a greener way that empowers those communities to do better?
I think it's very important because I think climate change is the biggest threat that we face right now. In fact, I was with a 4-star general last week, from America, who said it was an existential threat. And unless we really paid attention to it, it was a huge problem. And particularly in places like Africa, which are going to be a quarter of the world's population by 2050. So we need to be solving those problems now. And I think to your comment about tech, I think that, we really need to be thinking about what sort of tech are we using and what are we consuming? Because, for example, Bitcoin, as we all know, the mining gets more and more difficult. It consumes enormous power. And we shouldn't be using technology like that to solve problems where existing technology, which doesn't consume anything like that, actually works perfectly well. I mean, we're thinking of things like carbon cards, and actually cards that aren't made of plastic, that are made of corn, and things that can track your consumption and so on. But this is the absolute tip of the iceberg. I think what has to happen now, perhaps because governments are polarizing, is that big companies need to join together around the world and really hammer out how are we going to tackle this whole climate change problem, and not wait for the policymakers and the politicians to do this, because it's in all of our interests to solve it.
Yes. Thank you. You've talked about responsibility having to be the new normal for tech. That doesn't really, those aren't comfortable bedfellows necessarily, are they?
I'm still optimistic, because I don't think that people who are interested in innovation, who, some of the smartest brains on the planet, that's not a gender point, it could be from anywhere in the world, from any background at all, fundamentally want to try and improve something and make it better. And I feel as though this is a kind of moment of reckoning for technology. There's the East versus West, there's the flow of personal data, there's the climate crisis issues that we face, there's the people who, let's not forget, half the world's still not connected. But I think that if we can progress with a more cognizant view of intended and unintended consequences, both around product design, but also how we use it as individuals, then there is still so much that I was struck by you just saying about the corporate world coming together. Something I saw on Twitter this morning, a brilliant map showing that the top 100 companies, not the top 100, sorry, the 100 companies in the world that produce 80% of the carbon emissions. This is information I wouldn't have had access to just like that on my handheld device, and yet I feel more empowered to do something about it. So there is still so much to play for, but we have to do it, including as many people as possible in the conversation.
Thank you very much. On that note, we're going to do a quick scene change and thank our conversationalists very much. And just, very fortunately for us, both Martha and I think Anne are able to stay until the end of this session. So what I'm hoping is that when we have questions and answers, they'll still be mic'd up and they can join the conversation from there. So could I just ask our next panel to please join? I will move. So can we have Mark, Alison, Caitlin and Yannicka up on the stage. I'm not going to do a long introduction for each of our panel in the interest of time. You've got extensive biographies in the leaflet. We have Mark Blick. Oh, excellent. No, let's just... Oh, yes, I see what's going on here. We have, on my left, Mark Blick, who is the Head of Government Solutions at DigiNext, based in Hong Kong. We have Alison Gardner, who is a lecturer at Keele University and also co-founder Women Leading in AI. I think we'll be coming back to that. Caitlin Kraft-Buchmann, who's the founder and CEO of Women at the Table. And Yannicka Neeson, who is the founder of Capital IT. Welcome to the panel. We'll just be continuing, I think, this conversation about the next digital revolution. And particularly, we're thinking about, let's start with, the upside, the opportunities for women. Maybe, perhaps, Yannicka, as an angel investor, maybe we could start with you about, the opportunities for women and also, some of the gaps between, what should be and what is.
Yeah, well, I think a gap always indicates also an opportunity. If you look at tech in general, the percentage of women is still very low, and the percentage in leadership is even lower. I think it's 5%. So if you think about that, well, the future is all digital, it's all technology, then there's a huge opportunities for amazing jobs. And from an investor perspective, today worldwide, only 2.2% of VC funding goes to female founders.
2.2%.
Yes.
2.2% of VC funding goes to female founders.
Yeah, a few percent to diverse teams and over 90% to male founders. People of color get even less. And I think about last year, the most shocking statistic is that Juul, the e-cigarette company, on its own, and well, I hope we can all conclude it's a horrible company, but on its own received 10 billion more in funding than all women combined. So,
cigarette company.
So Juul, the e-cigarette company, on its own received 10 billion more in funding than all women combined. So that's rather shocking.
This is the bit of the session where we're talking about the good bits.
So there is massive opportunity. There's a lot of great entrepreneurs that are currently overlooked by VCs, women, people of color. It's not that if you're a white guy, you're automatically a better entrepreneur. It's just a stereotype. And all the investors are also almost all white men, and it's natural for people to invest in what they know and what they recognize, and they have this image of a successful entrepreneur. And so you see that men and women are really judged in a different way as well. So to give an example, a young woman is inexperienced, a young man has potential. A woman with a nice car, what is she going to do with our money? A man with a nice car, well done. So you have this...
When is she going to get pregnant, eh, Martha?
Yeah. So you have this double standard, but if you keep focusing on that, there's a lot of opportunities for people that look outside and look for the other brilliant entrepreneurs. And for me, somebody being different is always a great sign, because I know they've had to work so much harder to get where they are than some other people that I think they are a great investment anyway.
Thank you. Mark, so Diginex is active in the blockchain. We heard about blockchain in the earlier conversation. You were talking, we had a chat, and you were talking about blockchain's role in helping women refugees, which is not an application that I had immediately thought of. And maybe you could just sketch out what's happening and how it helps.
So it's migrant workers. So Diginex is a global blockchain solutions company. We're headquartered in Hong Kong. We have 7 offices worldwide and 120 people. I'm very happy to go into a brief intro of what blockchain is, if that's useful.
I think we're okay on that,
Okay.
aren't we?
Okay. About a year and a half ago, we started working with an organization called the Mekong Club. Some of you may be familiar with them. They're an NGO based in Hong Kong with a single issue around combating modern slavery in complex supply chains. We're very conscious as a tech company of we know what we can do, which is build stuff, but we also know what we don't know, and we need to rely upon people in the public sector to educate us on where we can apply that technology. I remember our first meeting over a year ago, and Matt and Phoebe turned up, and they're very humble and said we know nothing about blockchain, and then produced a white paper they'd written on how blockchain could be used to combat modern slavery, specifically around contract substitution and fees. And we spent a year working with them, and they have 33 members of their business association, large multinational companies across retail, footwear and apparel, financial services, and hospitality, so casinos and hotels. We spent 9 months working with a subset of 6 of those companies to build a platform that could help capture information as a migrant worker move from country of origin, so let's say from Bangladesh to country of origin, Malaysia, and then into the factory, and how you can surface trends of exploitation to be shared amongst both the brands who are purchasing from these companies, but also then NGO community, the international governmental organization community, auditing companies and ministries of labor or government officials. We went live in February this year. And as Claire articulately laid out earlier on, the issues of modern slavery, the 40.3 million affected worldwide, of which 25 million are in forced labor and 15 million in sexual trafficking, and of that, the vast majority, or a large percentage, 71%, are women. So how do we take this technology and drive impact for migrant workers, a large proportion of whom are women? And really it was focused on a couple of things. One, the transparency and the visibility and the voice of people through their migrant worker journey. Where are they? What fees are they paying? What contracts have they signed and agreed to? And what has been substituted? And second of all, focusing on the social audit process. So we know if I'm an apparel manufacturer and I'm paying a company to do a social audit process of the 15,000 companies that I contract from, it's a clipboard once a year and 300 questions. It's not that great. How can we capture as much information ahead of the visit as possible so that the audit process becomes less around data capture? Maybe it's around filling in holes in that data, but it's more about how do I engage with workers on the factory floor armed with information that I could have analyzed before the visit, and improving the efficacy of the visit, and also empowering NGOs with information they can view on a real-time basis. I mean, that's simple, so I'm going on a bit.
No, I'm just thinking about what you're talking about, and also reflecting on Anne's case study in the last conversation about, so this is a very practical use of the technology based on solving a human problem. And Caitlin, I'd like to just bring you into the conversation at this point. You know, we have the gap that Janneke talked about women not getting the funding, not getting the recognition. We have these case studies of just what can be done with technology to empower women. How important is it for women to be at the table while these decisions are being made, and you know, what can be done to sort of improve that?
Well, we work in, we're a global CSO. We work on systems change in governance and democracy, economy, technology, and sustainability. And in our work, we see that the qualitative dimension of women's representation is almost more important than the quantitative. So indeed, we need to have 50% of women at every table, everywhere, but that's not actually going to get you all the way to the solution of the problem, as we've seen very recently with the governor of Alabama signing into law that very stringent abortion law. So just because you're a woman doesn't make you a lovely, wonderful person who cares about other people, men and women. So I think that's a stereotype that I think we should really get rid of in this room. So we need people who are really going to be looking at looking at everybody and looking at this holistically. And can I just do a little bit about a landscape of what the problem with AI is? And Alison is going to jump in.
That will lead on to
Okay,
Alison.
but I think you need to know the scope of the problem before you can see what the solution is. So I'm going to start, and then you're going to go, and then we're going to go for the solution. So do you all know Amazon took 10 years of their resumes, and they built a sort of a recruiting tool to figure out what to do, and they benchmarked it against their engineering staff, which is basically male. So two things happened. One is what we would assume is it sort of decided that men should be hired for these jobs because men had always been hired for the jobs. But what's much more awful is it took the implicit data and made it explicit, and it deepened it. So what it did is it then disadvantaged women, threw them to the bottom of the queue, and it even figured out, because it took our implicit bias and made it explicit. It said, if you're a woman, you definitely don't belong. So if you were a woman chess champion, one woman's resume went to the bottom. And if you went to a women's college, even though you hadn't said it was a women's college, it went totally to the bottom of the queue. So what we know is there are lots and lots of these examples. There's examples of word embedding, taking women at a kitchen. Men are associated with hunting and sports. Women are associated with kitchens. So forks, knives, spoons, kitchen appliance associated with women. But also the machine takes it a step further when we go into machine learning and says when there's a man who's at a stove, he's labeled as a woman. So because it's taking all of our biases and it's making them explicit. Another example are brides. So we have this notion, so a woman in white wearing a veil, very pretty, all made up, bride. But an Indian woman wearing a veil and hennaed hands is folkloric. And it's a popular culture thing. It's just totally taken out. The machine doesn't recognize that as a bride because it's been programmed by people with a very Western focus, right? And we can use women and girls as the proxy for everybody that isn't included in this, right?
Sorry. Thank you, Caitlin. But I think that leads very, very neatly, and thank you for that, Caitlin, into your body of research on algorithmic bias. And, you know, first of all, did Caitlin represent that correctly?
I'm wondering what I'm going to say, what's left.
Yeah. But so that's the problem. Yeah. What do we do about it, and how do we start to unpick that and end up with, you know, more or less, but more neutral, less biased AI? Is it possible?
It
it is possible, but it's a huge fight. The answer is to get more women into the development teams, not only to identify the use cases we could solve, because they'll come up with different perspectives, so that's important, but also to spot the obvious, like biased data sets. And I was just talking to you earlier on about how people seem to think that we get this data set and we just plug it into the algorithm and it does its thing and out comes the answer. But actually the whole process takes an awful lot of decision making by the developers. So you have to clean the data, you have to process it, you have to, on some occasions, choose your features, and on some occasions actually select the weighting of those features as which ones you have most important. It then goes through the algorithm, and when the information comes back out, there's a whole load of decision making made there as to the trade-off between false positives. Do we put an innocent person in prison to a false negative? Do we release a violent criminal into society if we're looking at a recidivism algorithm? And how do that trade-off in terms of measurement of risk goes affects on accuracy? And then, of course, we have the aspect that everybody says, oh, well, we've got a human in the loop making the final decision, but it's a human in the loophole, really, because they just default to the algorithmic decision. And there is an issue with de-skilling of staff with that issue as well.
And also sort of naturally obeying the computer, right?
If
the computer
they
says
are
to do something.
not highly trained, the more knowledgeable you are about the tech, the more cynical you become. So this is where it's useful to have de-skilled staff making, lower skilled staff making the decisions. So I do worry about that. The solution, we've been trying to address the issue of the low representation of women in tech for many, many years. And it used to be a female field, as we all know, in the 1960s. Please read Ma Hick's book. And then they were deliberately engineered out of it. And in 1984, when all the other STEM subjects were increasing in the representation, computer science was going in that direction, and it still is. And for me, it's an endemic situation with the subject area. They're not leaking out of the pipeline. It's not a pipeline, it's a network. People come in at different points in life, but they're actually being forced out by very unfriendly tech culture and by an absolutely embedded way that the subject has been developed, which is very male-orientated. It's why we have toolboxes, to show our suite of applications. It's very subtle, but when you've got girls in 12, 13 choosing to go out of that subject, you have to think of this unconscious messaging that we have. So how do we address it? Well, we're trying to do the standards, and so I'm developing and working on P7003 with IEEE on the algorithmic bias standard, and I am absolutely trying to fight and get in there an absolute requirement to have diverse teams. But I do actually think we've been messing around with this for so long that we are going to need regulation and legislation which drives that requirement.
Very quickly, and then I'm going to come out to the audience for questions. So get ready.
So you know, there are laws. New York City has an algorithm law for accountability. Canada has just published something very fabulous. That's a checklist for algorithmic accountability. I mean, there's about 20 different ways that you could get to how you're going to do it, but the idea is just we're accountable.
It's important to understand that intentions are not always wrong. And it's not always in the algorithm. Sometimes you think you have a great idea, like you have this email service, Superhuman. They have been in the news a lot. They have received a lot of investment from Andreessen Horowitz, and they have a huge waiting list of people wanting to join them. So what they do in the email is, for example, track if an email is opened and where. And the idea is, if you see that your client lives in New York and it's opened in France, he's probably on holiday or at an event, so don't chase him. But for a lot of women, that means a way for them to be harassed because the other person knows where you opened that email. And so the intention is completely different, and the side effect is really horrible.
Mark, what can we learn from countries like India or Thailand about getting better gender balance into the development teams?
I think obviously it's a challenge in all countries that we work in. And my experience has been entirely in Asia and working in Southeast Asia over the last 20 years, and in China also. And I think if we look at tech companies broadly, you have the development teams, and they're more the other roles within a technology company. Much like Martha's point earlier on, I don't know how to code. I put myself through a night school on Python, but that's my limit. It's certainly we see in a number of countries that tech companies more broadly have a good balance, but still within coding and people who are writing algorithms, predominantly it is male. But if I look at the project team that we work on, yes, the coding team is predominantly male. But if I look at all the project managers and other people surrounding the product that we're bringing to market and working with migrant workers, that has a strong tendency towards more females.
Yeah, thank you. So, Dorothy, you had a question. Does anybody else like? Oh, great. Right, and let's get. Okay, so shall I start with you, and then I'm going to go back to. Let's get the microphone over this side, and then we'll sort of do a pincer movement and get you two as well. Should we take a couple of questions, come back, and then come back to you guys?
I just wanted to ask a question about who is the most powerful person in tech and who can actually bring any of the tech companies, the 4 big majors, to account. And there seems to be one European commissioner who actually fined successfully Facebook, I think. But that seems to be the only one. There are about 180 manifestos out there, principles, AI. Nobody has an international agreed manifesto, principles of diversity inclusion. So who would move the dial? Is it one person?
Thank you. I'm going to take another question as well. And also, Martha and Anne, if you'd like to join in with the responses to these, you're very welcome to.
Hi, I'm Alison Choi from Starling Bank. I work in tech. I love it. But yes, I agree there is a...
You're a coder?
I am, yeah.
Awesome.
Love it. Learned from YouTube, didn't do a degree on it. I agree, it's a difficult sector for women to work in. And it's funny because it used to be women's job. I think it's been mentioned recently. Like, it used to be considered secretarial work. And how is it that, you know, when personal computers came into the market, it was marketed to men and boys, and one marketing campaign just changed the entire industry? Why can't we leverage that and try and bring more women into the industry? Use the power of marketing and media representation to improve diversity in the field.
And it's not just bringing in, is it? It's the sort of the toxic working environment that many people are talking about, retaining women. And is that something that you're experiencing?
Yes, because actually, if you look at the numbers, I don't have the stats on me, but it's about 17% of women who start in tech. 12 years later, it's dropped by at least 5, and it's not actually family reasons that they're leaving. It's actually because it's a toxic environment.
Thank you. Martha, did you want to come in on either of those? Who's the most powerful, and how do we get more women in and staying in tech?
Well, I'm not being glib, Mel, but I feel that Donald Trump has a lot of power here right now. And I think that and the Chinese government, but I don't feel that they're going to be quite as amenable. But I think that the US has to take a lead in doing some stuff. And I think that, you know, I don't personally believe you can regulate the internet. I think you've got to break some of these companies up ASAP. And the arguments coming from Facebook around the kind of counter is absolutely nonsensical to my mind. So that would be the first thing. Use the tools, competition law and other bits of the law that we have to break up some of these companies and trench some of this stuff. And I think it has to come from the US to begin with. In terms of, you know, numbers of women in tech, it is still one of the most surprising, as I said, and dispiriting things to my mind that the numbers are just stuck and actually going backwards. And the McKinsey numbers, as I said, the current trajectory, we're never, ever going to reach parity in any manufacturing, engineering, science or technology sectors, ever. We're going backwards, and it's appalling. So I think we have to look at every single bit of the chain. It's not just schools or girls and learning, you know, different things at school. It's got to be recruitment practices, how you write job adverts, something as simple as if you write a job advert, and we've shown this now statistically, saying you've got to be able to C++, Python, Java, all that stuff, versus you're going to be solving this problem. Your numbers of job applicants by women goes up by, I think this is right, 65%. Someone on the panel might know more. Then you've got to look at how you appraise people, you've got to look at childcare, all of the things along the chain. I think if I had £1 for every single time a male tech leader says to me, so how do I solve this problem, as though there's one thing, then we could, fund an enormous program of work. It's nuts. It's not one thing. You have to do it hard work of micro incremental shifts across the entire spectrum of the sector, I would argue. Rant over.
Yannicka, Alison and Caitlin.
The multilateral girls here, I can just say, yes, there are lots of manifestos, of course. We're going to see the Secretary General of the UN just came out with a report. We're looking to do more in a multilateral setting. There's lots of different proposals from governments, from the EU, about how this is going to be discussed and then potentially regulated. That's why I'm saying there's about 20 different avenues that you could establish. But it's, well, now I think that everybody sees it's a different kind of problem. But one of the interesting things that's been filed in the US Senate, it's Cory Booker and Ron Wyden just in April, which is just to say is take the FTC and have them expand their footprint and be able to discuss the public good with companies that deal with over $100 million worth of and more than a certain number of million subscribers. So everybody has a different way to do this, and I think that until we come to an agreement, there will be, the EU will do one thing, US will do one thing, and hopefully we'll be able to learn from both parts of the pond.
I say that the inherent problem is this is a cross-border problem.
Yeah.
The very nature of tech, it doesn't have a constituency of a
Right.
country.
Well, that's why the UN wants to be involved, good or bad.
International agreement on anything would be the only way.
Thank you. Yannicka.
Yeah, I think if you look at who has power to do stuff, it's the CEOs of the big tech companies. And although they say they think it's important, they just don't act. So for them, it's not really a priority. Jeff Bezos could say, yes, this is what we want to achieve, and actually force to make that happen. And they simply don't. It's the same for Google, Facebook, all these companies. The numbers don't change, and I think they have the power to make those changes. And in terms of how do we make the change, it's correct that it's a lot of things that need to happen. But I think if we all look at ourselves and what we can do on a smaller scale is just talk about, if you work in tech, talk to kids about what you do, because they don't see it. You don't wear a uniform, so it's important that they do understand what you actually do and bring them along the journey. And a mistake we often make is to tell girls that they are pretty and boys that they are smart. And it's great to tell a girl that she's pretty, but also tell her that she's smart, because kids start to believe what you tell them. And if you think, oh, I'm pretty, that's what it is, you need to know that you can achieve anything.
Thank you. Mark, very quickly, because I
Just
want
on
to
the
go
first
back.
question, I think there is unfortunately no single person who will regulate it, but I think the very interesting work in motion we can see, and for those people who are familiar with the Libra Association that was launched last month. So the Facebook's cryptocurrency, which is not theirs, it's an association of 30 companies. MasterCard is one of them. No banks. You have Spotify and MasterCard, Visa. You also have NGOs like Mercy Corps, Kiva, and United Nations Women's Foundation. And this was the worst kept secret in the world, that Facebook were going to do this, but they launched it, and it was very interesting. And there's a degree of regulatory arbitrage, because everybody reacted slightly differently. SEC was quite cautious. They said, well, can you please stop until we work out what you're doing? Some countries were absolutely not, this isn't going to happen. Even within Europe, you had Britain, which is cautiously optimistic. You had French, which is more negative. So I think as we watch this,
It's really a crypto problem they're solving, or it doesn't need to be solved by crypto. It's a greed problem, isn't it?
it's many problems or challenges. I think the idea is interesting. So we work a lot with Burmese migrants in Thai farms, none of which, of course, have bank accounts, but all of whom have smartphones and using Facebook. And within 6 months may well have a wallet on their phones that they can send units of value to one another. So it's very interesting. But then you get into the regulatory arbitrage between Thailand and Burma, and going outside the banking system. So this is a really fascinating case of how regulations will react to a question, which is, what is it? WhatsApp, Instagram, Facebook, 2.8 billion users, so larger than any country. All who can have a wallet. This is always a problem with some aspects of digital assets, is you have to require people to download a wallet and install stuff, and it's a pain. Yeah. That's already been circumvented.
I've got the whole room's hopping with people wanting to ask questions, so I'm going to go along the front row, and then I've got people at the back as well. Let's just.
Yes, thank you. It's fascinating. So if regulation agreed worldwide won't happen, and if the GAFA of this world, the Jeff Bezos, the Mark Zuckerberg, won't care and won't change things, what can we do as user of technology? Is like, leave Facebook, don't buy on Amazon. How can we also act to make these companies change.
Thank you.
Well, I think you see
Wait a sec, I want to just take some questions.
Mine is very fast. I just want to mention a good example is a charity called Annie Cannon's presented at the UN. So basically they help the victim survivors. They actually train the women to be programmers. So it's like, it's trying to kind of ecosystem within, you know, if we don't do it, and then who else do you expect to do it?
Yeah, thank you. Dorothy? And I see you. I see.
Yeah, thanks. I think that we have to remember that people are doing business and they are in business for profit. And we have a huge lobby machinery that works in the US to make sure that we allowed certain companies to acquire certain other companies. And if we're not careful to go into this crypto area, which reinforces monopoly, because essentially they will be exploiting that data that they announced last month, that they have now integrated all the databases for Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram. So they will be exploiting that data to be able to make this solution work. And it's up to us to say no. And we can say no because we have finally got a few people who are aware within our parliamentary or legislative setups. But the problem is there are not enough people aware. And I think that is where we've really failed, because the lack of general awareness of the seriousness of these problems is just frightening. Whether it is algorithmic bias, which now we all talk about, but people don't realize how pervasive it is. And the fact that, and this is a question for Alison. I was on another panel, and somebody from a university said that for them, their challenge is that they can't train their students adequately at the higher level because they don't have access to the large databases. The concentration of control over the large databases is so limited, I shouldn't say limited, is so high that if you're training students, you wouldn't be able to access enough data to be able to get them to the level that they need to be. And I just want to remind, just quickly, because I am the chairperson for the Information for All program at IFAP, I just want to remind us that all of us, there are a number of member states represented here, we have signed on to a number of agreements internationally that we should not forget. For example, Rome, rights-based, open, access, multi-stakeholder. We all signed onto it. So we should use those frameworks to get what we want.
Thank you very much. I've got Alison, and then I think Anne wanted to come in on those, so please.
There's a lot of ways that I could like to respond, so I'll try and keep it really short. Firstly, I don't disagree with anything that's been said. The problem is that all of that's been said was said 10 years ago as well. We're having the same conversations. So I have lost patience. And I want us to be radical. So I'm fed up of saying, why don't we have enough women in tech? So I want the question to be, why do we have too many men in tech? So let's just change the question. And we need to change the culture. And this is, again, is about this really hard-hitting requirements. Who was the CEO who was forced out of a position because she kept on going on about diversity too much? And it was not a value judgment. This is really important in our systems that we address that issue, which is why I started Women Leading in AI, to develop this community, this powerful voice. There isn't a one person. What there is 51% of the world's population. If we stand together and connect together, we can fix this, but we need to have that connection. So this is why we did Women Leading in AI, and hopefully it'll grow. And Alison, I feel your pain.
I'm just going to go to Anne first, and then I'll come back to you, Caitlin.
So, Alison, I completely agree. And there's a Chinese saying that women hold up half the sky. So, first of all, in response to what can you do, I'm actually the co-chairman of the 30% Club. There is many things you can do. We are a tech company, MasterCard. We have 40% women. We have 30% women at a senior level in our company. And anyone who joins the 30% club, the chairman and the CEOs join, and they commit to doing this for their company. That's one thing. The other thing, there are investor groups now, such as BlackRock, that are going around saying, unless you've got enough women represented at a senior level in your company, unless you've got enough women on your boards, we're going to vote against you in the shareholder meetings. And this is starting to take effect. So it's not a regulation thing, but it is a big impact thing in the corporate world that I think actually will change things. I want to say one thing about Libra, because we are part of Libra. Libra is not like Bitcoin. Libra is a fiat-backed digital currency. It's nothing like Bitcoin. The other thing to say about it is Facebook are taking an equal share with all of the other members in the consortium. They're not leading the consortium. It's completely balanced and equal, just like setting up any other association. And we and Visa are in there. We have to comply with all of the anti-money laundering rules around the world, regulation in the over 200 countries that we operate, and all of the privacy laws, Europe being the lead in that, but now that's rolling out across the world. So actually having a consortium like this with players like us in there will mean that the thing that you develop actually complies with all of the regulations, which I actually believe is a good thing.
Thank you very much. You had a very quick one. While we get you the microphone.
Can I just jump in really quick? I've been, honestly, we're going for fights.
Let's go for Caitlin first.
Okay.
Because she's not had much of an airing
Well,
recently.
I would just beg everybody to look at systems change. So adding women is very, very, very important, but we need to look at the system and how the system works, and adding women isn't going to change necessarily. Fitting women into the system isn't going to change everything. And so our immediate action is that we're starting to advocate and put together cities, municipalities, with universities that have data scientists and social scientists, together with the private sector in very specific geographies, but in all continents, to look at how we can have positive discrimination, for lack of a better word, hate it, affirmative action for algorithms. So the algorithms would correct for the bias, not merely just make sure there is no bias. So that was the idea that I was trying to get through at the beginning.
I know you want to come in, Alison. I'm going to go out to the audience, so hold the thought, and hopefully there'll be another. And have we got somebody at the back who wanted to come in? Okay, so you've been waiting patiently. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ruby Alcantara, representing Supiva. We support entrepreneurs in emerging markets and also advisor to Oceano Capital. We're an impact investor supporting projects in and around Africa. Leapfrogging, the ability to leapfrog in emerging markets. And we're talking about system change, but how about we can fundamentally change some of these emerging markets already? We saw what technology has done with M-Pesa or mobile payments. I spent a lot of time in East Africa myself. When I came back to the first world, I'm like, oh, this is a bit backwards. What do you mean I can't pay with my phone? This is strange. How do I use cash? So, I think emerging markets have this phenomenal ability to get out of this 17% of women in tech, and can we employ much more women in tech in the emerging markets? That number is also parallel with investment banking, which is also quite scary when I think of my colleagues who are investment banking. So how can we as investors, entrepreneurs, program managers, accelerators in many of these emerging markets facilitate and encourage the ability to leapfrog and make sure that we aren't stuck with some of these terrible systems that we are stuck with?
Thank you very much. I've got you at the back, and can we get a microphone down here at the front as well?
Thank you very much. Sandy Rees-Jones, Women in Property, Chartered Builder, Fellow of the Women's Engineering Society. I thought we were the worst industry, so I'm quite... it's been quite a good morning for me, really.
Technology.
Yes, I'm going to be speaking later, so I won't take too much time. I remember some years ago a wonderful piece of research when the IT industry was desperate for people. they went and discovered a fantastic pool of just the right people to fill the skills gap, which were army wives. They were bored, they were educated, they were intelligent, they were clustered in nice areas around the country. It was absolutely brilliant. And what happened, I don't know whether you know about this, it was a brilliant report, I'll dig it out of my archive, right? So they needed people, so they went out creatively and found them, and then of course everything leveled off and everything was fine, so we won't bother anymore, and it disappeared. But if you have a people shortage, you have to be very creative. Now, in construction, we're about 14%. It varies across. We're not going backwards, and now, of course, we desperately need people. So there is this driver now, rather like follow the money, which is where do you find the people? And there's a fantastic woman called Jess Wade, who has set herself the target of putting every woman who's been a scientist or an engineer on Wikipedia, and she's succeeding. I helped launch the Big Bang Engineering and Science Fair, where we got people in. There are ways of doing it. So how important is the lack of people as well as the toxic environment that will help you drive your argument?
Thank you very much. And we'll just take one more down the front, and then I'm going to come back to the panel.
Thank you very much. My name is Lan O'Connor, and I'm from the Cabinet Office, and I'm also a civil engineer turned tech. So we're not alone. There's at least 3 of us in the room. It's not really a question, it's just a comment. And I was kind of, Caitlin, you mentioned something similar in the US, I guess. I deal with the major tech suppliers to government, not all of them, but a number of them, those who do more than £100 million a year business with government. And we try to execute a number of policies, be it modern slavery or trying to get 30% of the revenue with a particular supplier passed on to SMEs. So we execute these policies. And one of the policies that we really push hard on is diversity. Given the reporting on the gender pay gap, that's an opening to have a conversation with these companies about exactly this. And because I deal with the tech companies, it is that moment. It's not the one person with power, but it is the execution of a policy, and it happens in CEO to CEO conversations. So if anybody wants to talk to me about it afterwards, I'm very happy to talk about it. But I just wanted to tell you, rest assured, something is happening. We have meetings which are not to do with contracts or delivery or specific items that a company has contracted to do for a department. It's exactly this relationship level that we work on. It's strategic, and we are working on that one. But I'm very happy to share any information later.
Great. So we've got leapfrogging in emerging markets. We have people shortages as a sort of, being the mother of invention, if you like, and diversity policies in procurement. Who'd like to have a go at that?
I'm just going to touch, because there's a word called education which should have bubbled up much earlier on, and it links back to what I said about the pipeline, and what you've just outlined with the Army wives. That there isn't a shortage of people, there isn't a shortage of interest. I got my PhD and taught myself to code in my 40s and got my PhD at 50. A lot of crying and a divorce. But we're just under this degree apprenticeship programme now to help deal with these shortage areas of data science, and we're building this data science degree, which I'm the programme director of, embedding ethics into it throughout, not as a separate module, but throughout this ethical and social and corporate responsibility ethos. People are coming in in an unusual, non-traditional educational path, as women often do, and entering this field there with that supportive nature. So the input that we're getting with the degree apprenticeships is possibly about 50% women, if not higher, and they are doing better than the traditional linear educational route. So I think we can be inventive as to how we recruit people into it. But then, of course, I have to say, we have to maintain them within that area. The leapfrogging idea, I think, is fantastic, and how you can create your systems from afresh. And very quickly with the regulation, it is good, but the lobbyists are all over the regulations, as they are all over the standards, the ISO standards in it, the politics in trying to control how those are written, and the New York one, which started as a very good accountability bill, just ended up having an ethics expert panel who are basically impotent because the public service wouldn't give them any of their information on their algorithms, so they did nothing for an entire year. So we've got to be very careful about the regulation. So this is why we said we need this big rise in voices and attending these events to make sure that it's steered in the correct way. Otherwise, again, it's meaningless.
Final remarks from our remaining panellists addressing those questions of leapfrogging, of procurement. Caitlin.
So we have a declaration. In the declaration, it does talk about leveraging procurement, government procurement in particular, because we think it could open up a sort of a floodgates for women-owned AI companies and gender balance. And we have a whole series of recommendations. We'd love to share the declaration with all of you. Around ethics and AI, we're working with EPFL, which is a technical university in Switzerland, to have the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights do a human rights module in the first year of computer science programming. And I just want to applaud and say I think that really needs to be embedded in everything. And in terms of leapfrogging, we see now that the future World Economic Forum said last week, the future of AI is going to be in Africa. So they're really well ahead. There's extraordinary intellectual capital there, and I think it's coming all over everywhere. And the one mistake that we make is to think that it's going to happen like industrialization.
Thank you. Janneke.
Yes, I think on your point, what you see is that investors are still quite traditional and they have this one view of an entrepreneur. I think diversity on the side of VCs is really important, but also to realize that this idea that as an entrepreneur you have to work for free for a few years implicates that actually you can only be an entrepreneur if you come from a wealthy family or from an environment where people can support you. And there's so many people who don't have that support and still can be brilliant entrepreneurs. So we need to also look at that different.
Thank you very much. Mark.
I guess two sides of the same coin. One, speaking within the lens of my own company, gender balance is of course important. It's always a challenge. We have 30% women in our company. We always look to improve that. But then also the other side of that coin is the impact of technology to a broader community. We work on two main projects. One, I've mentioned about migrant workers that didn't have a gender lens, but 71% of the people that we're working with are women. And then a project that we're about to start in Hong Kong that is very close to my heart because of the way Hong Kong is structured around domestic migrant workers, 99.9% of whom are women. And how we can begin to use technology well, if we work on fundamentally good causes that can help validate blockchain technology, then I think we as an industry rise. And that's been very much the purpose of our company, of how do we find projects that validate the technology, which is terrific, but are also fundamentally good at the core as well.
Thank you very much. I think that's a nice uplifting note on which to end. Lunch is served upstairs where you were, and Stefan has said that we will restart at 2:40, so an extra 10 minutes, a full hour for lunch. Okay, thank you very much to our great panel and to Anne and to Martha. Thank you very much.